Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Joe Patrick on Football. You can see here we have a little bit different location as opposed to our normal recording of the podcast. We are here, of course, if you're only listening to us on audio, we're on the field at Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Unfortunately, after the Falcons lose their home opener to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, a division rival, in a bitter defeat, 23-20 is the final score. And a lot of negatives coming out of it. There are some positives. We'll get into some of the positives and the negatives, but this is just going to be a quicker, instant reaction type show where ultimately the main reaction that everybody's going to have is going to be to Younghoe Koo, who was obviously one of the points of focus during training camp, having had a really poor season last year, where he ultimately ends up getting not benched, but sat down to recover from an injury that was supposedly the cause of the poor season that he had. And then has a big psychological hurdle to clear in this game. Kind of the perfect litmus test, actually, for what he had to overcome, and ultimately does not overcome it at the end of the game, missing a 44-yard field goal, and that would have sent the game to overtime. And, you know, who knows what would have happened from there, but clearly that miss is going to be the topic of conversation for Falcons fans for sure, and it's got to be one of the main topics of conversation behind the building. Not that that's the only thing that led to this loss, because we'll get into it. There were some other real big issues that the team had ultimately, that their offense just was not able to get going and sustain itself. But that Koo miss is going to loom large, and it should, maybe it was surprising to me that he did not show up to his locker room, or he was already cleared out by the time media got in there. That's important, because I want to give Koo credit. He has missed some big kicks before, as last year, everybody knows, and he's always owned up to it, always kind of stood in his locker and faced the music, knows the questions are going to come, and today was different. Today he was not there, and it says something, I think, about the mentality of this kicker right now, and, it raises the question of what the Falcons should do. Obviously, the Falcons have another kicker. They had another kicker in camp, Lenny Craig, who was, supposedly the competition for Younghoe Koo. Koo won that competition. He was the better kicker. And I would say, to that point, anyone who right now is calling for Lenny Craig to be the kicker going forward, I don't think so. I mean, to me, he's still a developmental kicker. It's not that I think that Koo is, set in stone as the kicker for this team, but ultimately, I don't think that he's ready to go right now either. And so I think the Falcons, if they are considering an alternative, might need to look elsewhere. I know in USFL, that's a place where this team has scouted heavily and resourced players from before. There are some kickers that have shown some promise in that league, and we'll see if there are more workouts and potentially even more competition. They can keep hold of Lenny Craig and just keep him as their international developmental player for the rest of the season, and they can still bring in other kickers if they want to activate someone and make a change at that spot. But who knows? That's going to be a conversation that takes place this week, and Raheem Morris is going to have to answer more questions about it. But ultimately, to me, it's not the reason necessarily why the Falcons lost this game. To me, the biggest reason was that there was no semblance of a running game. I mean, the team ran the ball 22 times between Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier. It's two running backs. And the longest carry the team had on those 22 carries was 6 yards by Bijan Robinson. Tyler Algier had a 5-yard carry. That was Tyler Algier's longest carry. They just weren't able to open up holes. They weren't able to create push like they normally do. And we've talked about that on the show, that's the reason that you were worried about losing a right tackle like Caleb McGarry, because you felt like with what he brought to the run game on that right side of the line, you could go to that well and you could run behind him and you had confidence that you were going to be able to pick up yards. As it turned out in this game, right next to us here is where the team was late in the game trying to score. Ultimately, they do punch it in by the skin of their teeth. Michael Penix just extending the ball over the goal line, keeping his knee above the ground long enough to get that score. But, the team should have scored in far easier fashion than that. And they should have been able to run some time off the clock. But they had to resort to, I don't want to necessarily say it was trickeration, but considering you're on the goal line, they were running sweeps. They passed the ball and stopped the clock for a moment. It just made life more difficult on the team today, not being able to run the ball and sustain drives. And ultimately what happened was they got off to a lightning quick start. Michael Penix hits Bijan Robinson for a 50-yard touchdown on the third play of the game. The team looks like they're going to have a massive day offensively after that play, and then they just kind of lose themselves. They don't have an identity on the field. It wasn't really until the fourth quarter where they had to come back from a deficit where they kind of just went air raid, for lack of a better term, and that's when they started having success. Michael Penix ultimately ends up with 298 yards passing, 1 touchdown, no interceptions. That touchdown obviously coming on the 50-yard score to Bijan Robinson. That was really just a check down that Bijan Robinson makes a player miss and takes it to the house. And that leaves you wondering what this Falcons offense really is, and I was, like last year in the opener, not super impressed with Zach Robinson and some of the calls that were made. And I know you can always scrutinize the coaching and the play calling, and they should have done this, they should have done that. But I thought there were some core issues that the team had that was telling. One was that Michael Penix was hardly ever under center in this game. In fact, I think it wasn't until one of the final snaps of the game when they were down here on the goal line where they finally did get under center. But even when they had 4th and shorts earlier in the game, or when they were down here on the goal line at 1st and goal from the 1, they're in pistol trying to run it up, and then ultimately they lose yards in those situations because the line is allowing a surge off of that snap. And so there's definitely some things to correct. And I don't know, the reason why it's confounding to me is that there's no reason why this team shouldn't be able to get under center and run a quarterback sneak, or even just just try to get a push with a quick hitter up the middle from under center. But I think when you're under center, it gives that offensive line a better chance to have that initial push than when they are in the shotgun at the center position. So a little bit concerning there, and some work to do. Ultimately, though, there is still some confidence I think you have to have in this offense and in the quarterback, Michael Penix, the way that he had the moxie that was needed. And I think we expected it of him, but it was good to see that in the final moments of the game, he leads an 18-play touchdown scoring drive that could have been the winner. I tweeted out right after that score that this was eerily reminiscent of the exact way the Falcons lost to the Buccaneers the last time they lost to this team, which was 2 years ago in this building. They lose in a very similar fashion. They score late in the game. Baker Mayfield leads a game-winning touchdown. He hits Cade Otton down in that other end zone for a score. That was in 2023. This time, Baker Mayfield throws another dart, and the team scores with a minute left. That left the Falcons another opportunity to drive down the field, and they do that. Again, credit to Michael Penix and this offense. When they were just having to air it out toward the end of the game, they were having a lot of success, and they even had some opportunities to throw toward the end zone. Kadero Hodge nearly comes down with or could have had a chance to come down with the ball had he turned his head around quick enough and been able to locate a ball from Michael Penix, where he just said he had to get rid of that a little bit earlier. But ultimately, we come out of the locker room, and obviously, there's only one mood that you see in there from the players after a game like this, which is pretty, utter dejection. Obviously, the team is, still optimistic about what they can do going forward, and they're not quitting on the season. But ultimately, it's a bitter pill to swallow, because it felt like this was an opportunity that you had against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers that were missing so many pieces. Without Tristan Wirfs, without Chris Godwin, without Jalen McMillan, several players on the defense, several young players that they were relying on this season, all out, and it felt like this was a game for the taking here at home. Ultimately, the team does not get off to that good start that they wanted. So it's a tough one for the Falcons, and they don't come back here for a few weeks. They're not going to be back here until September 28th at home against the Commanders, which is going to be another tough game. They're going to go on the road and play the Minnesota Vikings next week on Sunday Night Football, and then they will travel to Carolina for another division game that feels like at this point it's hard to say it's a must-win after one game into the season, but that's one that certainly the team is going to need to have after you lose a divisional game at home to start the season. There was some sloppiness from the team as well, it must be said. There was some, pre-snap penalties. You had to burn timeouts here and there. There was especially one on the first play of a drive where the team comes out and is not able to, get in formation correctly, and they have to burn a timeout. There's going to be questions about whether, the lack of preseason affected the team's inability or, messiness in that area of the game. Another thing that Raheem Morris is going to have to deal with. Another could be a big problem. We'll find out more about this later in the week, but Drake London, there was a late play where he had a drop/incompletion. It would have been a tough catch, but did hit him right in the numbers. Hard pass by Penix. He comes down on his shoulder, leaves the field, and I believe went to the locker room. I did not spot him on the sideline. I didn't see the tent up either, so I believe he went into the locker room, and he did not return. He was out for both of the fourth downs, one that was replayed and then ultimately the one that Penix gets in on. London was not on the field, as well as the final drive with just 59 seconds left in the game. Drake London was not on the field for that as well. If it's a serious injury, that's going to put this Falcons team in a hole, a team that was without Darnell Mooney already coming into this one. And, you know, I believe that Darnell Mooney will likely be back next week, I would think, considering he was a game-time decision for this one. But still, it's hard. I think it's a little bit easier to find somebody who can replicate what Darnell Mooney does to an extent in a player like Casey Washington, for example, today, versus a player who can do what Drake London does. There's a reason why Drake London is, considered one of the premier wide receivers in this league. It's because he has a physical skill set and tool set that really can't necessarily be matched. And yes, there are guys, David Sills, I believe, would be the player who kind of comes in and does some of those things, but it's going to be a tall task for him to be able to be relied upon the way that Drake London obviously can be relied upon. So there's going to be a lot of question marks for the Falcons to take care of this week. And again, it's just a bitter defeat here to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I want to talk about the defense real quick before we get out of here. There was, again, some good and some bad on display from a young defense, and I think that considering the youth and considering the inexperience, the fact that you're working with a new defensive coordinator, I think you can expect there are some areas that were never going to be perfect, not just in this game, but even in this season, and you just kind of hope to see improvement. And I think that what you saw today, you saw some good and some bad. The good started right in the first quarter. Team got 2 3-and-outs straight off the jump, 2 3-and-outs in a row. I don't think that happened all year last year. I mean, it may have happened in the game against the Raiders. That was a slugfest, but that was a promising start. Ultimately, because the Falcons were not really able to sustain much offensively, put the defense under a bit of pressure. They did ultimately end up being on the field a little bit longer. Once they were not able to just force those quick 3-and-outs, I think you could start to see some of the fatigue wear and Baker Mayfield start to work his magic and able to do the Baker Mayfield things. But ultimately, you hold the Buccaneers team to 23 points. Not terrible. Could have been better. Xavier Watts nearly has an interception that turns into a touchdown for Emeka Egbuka when he just underreads the trajectory of a Baker Mayfield throw. You think on another day, maybe that could be an interception that is a kind of a game-changing type of play. And that's the kind of thing that gives you hope. But ultimately, there was just that. I think it underscores just a little bit of the lack of execution that the defense had today. Also, just didn't get to the quarterback the way I think that a lot of us would have hoped after what was a promising preseason, and you had so much hope in guys like James Pierce Jr., Jalen Walker, and I make no doubt those players will make impact plays. Those guys will get their fair share of sacks, but ultimately not able to get home today, and weren't able to corral Baker Mayfield on some key moments. And that was always going to be expected to an extent. I mean, Baker Mayfield is just a gamer for that exact reason. He has utter respect from so many players in that Falcons locker room. Anyone you ask about him, they just say that the guy's a baller and he's got experience and he's able to find yards that he needs in those situations. And there was Caden Ellis had in one of those third downs, those 3-and-outs early in the game. Caden Ellis had a big stop on Baker Mayfield, but ultimately the Falcons lose contain on him one too many times. He's able to escape the pocket and either find somebody downfield or pick up yards that he needs with his legs. And so you hope that the team will be able to more effectively get home on some other quarterbacks later on this season. But I thought there were some green shoots for that defense. They came out with the energy that you expect. They were tight in coverage. I think you saw some good performances from some individual players, namely Divine Diablo. I thought he was all over the place, making plays. His length really stands out at that linebacker position. There were question marks about Divine Diablo and how well he was going to be able to, play the run, have those big run fits, those big run stops. And I thought that he was quite good in some of those moments and really kind of, sticking his head in there, for lack of a better term, and making some big stops. And so I think that's portends good things for this defense, but it's going to be a work in progress, and they're probably never going to be a perfect unit over the course of the season. The recipe for success for this Falcons team is going to be, pairing this young, exciting defense that can make some plays with a high-powered offense, and that high-powered offense was just something that didn't really show up today. I was a little bit surprised, going back to the offense, I was just a little bit surprised with the lack of really big shots being taken downfield. There were some, of course, and there were some chunk plays, especially on some of these late drives. when Tampa Bay was sitting off a little bit. But earlier in the game, they were really coming up and pressing the Falcons receivers at the line of scrimmage and really challenging them, I thought, to go past them. And the Falcons never really took some of those opportunities. They also really didn't get Kyle Pitts involved in the game until a little bit late on. And I think that it's no surprise that once they did start getting him involved, they started making, things were happening for the offense. And it might be an offense that has to pass to set up the run, which has not been the case in Atlanta for the last several years. They've had this, really good running offensive line that was kind of drafted and developed first under Dimitroff, but then with Chris Lindstrom, of course, and Jake Matthews, but then Arthur Smith's tenure really kind of reinforcing that run game, and you thought that was going to be something that Zach Robinson could kind of take and then add a prolific passing attack to. I think they do have that prolific passing attack potentially, but it's really hard to do, I think, a lot of the things that the Falcons wanted to do today when they just had no run game and they were in just really bad downs and distances for, I think, some of the play action that they wanted to dial up. It is worth noting, to go back to the offense, they were in 12 and 21 personnel, way more in this game than I remember them ever being in a game last season under Zach Robinson. Zach Robinson comes from a scheme in LA where he was before Atlanta that was very heavily 11 personnel. That would be 1 tight end, 1 running back, 3 wide receivers. And he said last year that they were going to mix it up. They didn't really mix it up. They were still, I think they were the heaviest 11 personnel team, or the team that used 11 personnel the most in the NFL last year. If not the most, it was nearly the most. And not the case today. They were using a bunch of 12 personnel. Did that have anything to do with Darnell Mooney being out? Potentially, I know Ray McLeod, Kadero Hodge had kind of been banged up a little bit toward the end of training camp. Don't know how much any of these injuries impacted that game plan, but I think it was interesting to see, and I think that there is an opportunity for Kyle Pitts to really emerge more as a receiver and have a little bit more volume to his receiving game than he's had in recent years if they do go with that kind of 12 personnel package. And they even use 21 personnel. They use 21 personnel by splitting Bijan Robinson out wide and using Tyler Algier as a running back. They went 5 wide with some of these personnel sets. So there was some interesting stuff in that respect that I think that there's some promise for, but there's just some execution things that need to be refined. And again, I think in the run game, they're gonna have to figure out a way to, if they're not able to create push, maybe they need to do some more gap scheme runs to just kind of create some smaller gaps in the interior that Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier can try to slither through if they're not able to kind of push guys off the line of scrimmage like they have been in the past. So a lot of questions to answer on that front, but we'll get more answers. We'll get more data points as the games continue now. We are into football season, and we'll be here again the rest of the week to take you through it. We'll have more after we kind of rewatch the game, have some reflections in that sense, and then we will be back talking to the staff. Raheem Morris speaks on Monday, where I'm sure he'll have more to say about Younghoe Koo and the rest of these issues that we brought up on today's show. Thank you guys so much for listening. You can follow me on JAPatrick200 on X, and definitely follow 92.9 The Game on YouTube. That's where you can view the podcast and our beautiful backdrop here at Mercedes-Benz Stadium on the field. You can follow the podcast if you want to listen to it on audio form. Just search Joe Patrick on Football wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you guys next time.